On a late afternoon, toward the end of the month of February, two distinguished-looking gentlemen sat at a mahogany table in a Kentucky plantation house. Their heads were together over the table. They were discussing very important business. The first gentleman, a Mr. Haley, was wearing a loud waistcoat that clashed with the color of his neckerchief. He had an ample middle with a big gold watch chain draped across it. His short, stubby fingers were rough and calloused, but they glittered with several golden rings. His voice was loud and obnoxious. The other gentleman seated across from him, a Mr. Shelby, the owner of the plantation, was dressed in the manner of a true gentleman. "Well," said Mr. Shelby, the plantation owner, "it distresses me greatly to have to part with my good servant Tom, but as I owe you the money and I can't see any other way around it, I will agree to sell my right-hand servant if that is agreeable to you. You will find that Tom is a very dependable fellow, a truly good man." "Well," says Mr. Haley, "he's truly good as slaves go." "No," said Mr. Shelby, repeating himself most emphatically, "he is truly a good man." "There's some folks that say there's no such thing as a good African." "Well, those folks would be incorrect. I tell you that Tom is an excellent servant. I trust him running my entire plantation. I never give it a second thought. He's always been very faithful and true." "Well, fine. Now, let's see. Your bill is $1,400, and Tom's worth about, I'd say, 1,000 in the New Orleans market, so you owe me 400 more. How you want to settle the rest of your debt? You could give me some jewelry, maybe, from your wife." "Well, my wife has jewelry, but nothing that's that expensive." "Maybe we can make a horse trade." "I need the horses to run my farm." "Well, then, maybe you could throw in another servant. You got a serving wench or a little boy that you could toss into the bargain?" Mr. Shelby was already grieved that he had to sell Tom, and he was horrified to hear Mr. Haley, most undesirable slave trader, talking in such a fashion. And just as Mr. Haley spoke, the door of the parlor popped open and a little boy came running in. African, and he was about 4 years old, and he ran right over to Mr. Shelby and scrambled up onto his knees, sang Mr. Shelby the most delightful song you ever heard. Mr. Shelby reached to the table and picked up some raisins from a bowl and handed them to the boy as a treat. And then a lady walked into the room, obviously this beautiful little boy's mother. Though she was African and served the house as a slave, she walked like a queen. She came right over and scooped the boy off of Mr. Shelby's knees and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, master. He got away from me. I didn't want him to come in here and disturb your business." "Oh, no, now that's all right, Eliza. Don't give it a second thought," said Mr. Shelby. "You know how I dote on your little boy, Harry. He's my delight. It's all right if he wants to come in. He kind of lightened the mood, so to speak, but it's probably best if you take him out now." Mr. Shelby watched as Eliza carried the little boy across the room and shut the door behind her. After Eliza shut the door, she stood behind it, listening to the conversation. "Well," says Mr. Haley, "now there it is, the very article. How about you sell me that little boy for $400? Mr. Shelby was horrified. "Why, you just saw his mother. You see how she dotes on him. I would never sell a child away from his own mother. What kind of barbaric thing are you proposing?" "Why, now, I'll tell you how to handle that. African women, they don't see their children like whites do. If you were to send her on an errand for a day or two, I'd come and take the boy away while she's gone. And when she comes back, the whole ugly business will be done and over with. Why, she might cry and carry on for a while, but your wife can give her a pair of earrings or a new dress to make up for it." Mr. Shelby was stunned. But he owed this man $1,400, and he had no other way to pay the debt. "If you don't sell me that little boy you call Harry, then I'll have to foreclose on this banknote, and you will lose your home. So which is it going to be?" Mr. Shelby was pressed to it, but he agreed to sell Tom, his best servant, his faithful helper, and Eliza's little boy named Harry. He asked Mr. Haley to keep it quiet. "Oh, yes, yes, certainly. I'll keep everything hush, hush. I'll call in the morning for both of those slaves just as soon as you have them ready." Mr. Shelby agreed. The only problem with this transaction was that Eliza was listening on the other side of the door. And when she heard them make a bargain for her son, she decided to run. Late that night, when all the people in the big house were asleep in their beds, Eliza bundled her little boy up in a quilt, put the ends of the quilt around her shoulders and tied them tight, made herself like a sling to carry her child, and then, as quiet as a cat, she went out of the big house and down to the slave cabin to tell Uncle Tom what was about to happen. When she rapped on the door, Tom came to the door, all sleepy and bleary-eyed. "Oh, Tom, I hate to disturb you, but I have the most distressing news. The master has done gone and sold you and my little boy Harry." Tom couldn't believe it. What? Surely Master Shelby wouldn't do such a thing. He had even promised Tom that he could have his freedom after Master Shelby died. No, Master Shelby, he's a good man," said Eliza, "but he has gotten himself into some sort of trouble. He owes a man money, and the only way he could see clear of it was to sell you, and he threw my little Harry into the bargain. I can't let my boy go. I'm going to run, and you should come too." Tom feared the slave catchers and the dogs, and so he decided to stay. But Eliza said she would run. And with that last word, she ran off down the road and off into the shadows of the woods. There in northern Kentucky, they weren't far from the Ohio River, and she was hoping to make it somehow across the river and into Ohio, where maybe she could get onto the Underground Railroad and get all the way to Canada and find freedom for herself and her boy. By the next morning, it was all over the plantation that Eliza had run away. Her mistress had discovered her room empty, the bed covers all messed up, and of course Harry was missing too. All the little slave children who lived on the row in the plantation were talking about it and hoping Eliza would make it to freedom. One of the children looked at another and said, "Ooh, let's sit up on the porch rail and watch for that old slave catcher, Mr. Haley, to come. When he comes, we'll tell him Eliza run off with Harry, and then we can listen to him cuss. He's sure to say all kind of awful things, and we can hear him cuss." So all the children sat on the porch rail and watched for Mr. Haley to come. Late that morning, he started up the drive on his big white horse, whip in hand, and they leaped off the rail and started running round and round and round that big white horse like a little flock of birds, and they were saying things like, "Eliza done run. She heard you gone by her boy Harry, and she run off. They done gone to Ohio." Oh, and they weren't disappointed. Mr. Shelby leaped off that horse, cussing a blue streak. He stomped in the house, slapping the wall with his riding whip. Mr. Shelby leaped out of his chair and said, "I will remind you, sir, that you are a gentleman. Now, if you will sit down and conduct yourself in a civil manner, we will see what is to be done. I am as embarrassed as anyone about this situation. But Eliza is only a girl in slippered feet, and she's carrying a 4-year-old child. She could not have gotten far. I will send 2 of my servants with you to retrieve your property." And then Mr. Shelby went out onto the porch and he called 2 slave men, Sam and Andy. He asked them to go down to the barn and saddle horses and ride with Mr. Haley to catch up to Eliza. When Sam and Andy brought the horses back up from the barn, they saw Mr. Haley's horse standing there in the yard. It was a kind of a flighty creature. Sam turned to Andy and with a wink he said, "You know, this horse seems awfully spooky, if you know what I mean." The horse was standing under a big chestnut tree. Sam reached down and picked up a chestnut burr. Now, a chestnut is hard in the middle, but all around the outside it's covered with spines, just like a little porcupine. He lifted the saddle of that big white horse, stuck that chestnut burr right underneath it, and eased the saddle back down. "You know," says Sam to his friend Andy, "this horse is so flighty. If it was to jump and roll Mr. Haley off in the road, it would probably scare our horses, and they'd probably run too." "Mm-hmm," says Andy with a knowing look. Little while, Mr. Haley, the slave catcher, came out of the house. He stuck a foot into the stirrup and swung himself onto that big horse, and as soon as his rear end made contact with that saddle and that burr was pressed down into the horse's flesh, he reared up and threw Mr. Haley off into the road, and then Sam and Andy let go of their horses and said, "Oh my goodness gracious!" And all three horses tore off down through the lower pasture. Sam and Andy went running after them. "Bring those horses back here," barked Haley, as if those slaves were his servants and he could order them around. "Right now, on the double! We have no time to lose." Sam and Andy made the biggest show. All the children of the plantation were hooping and hollering and carrying on and clapping their hands. They pretended to stumble over one another. They let the horses run for a good hour or so. Finally, they brought the horses back up into the yard. Their plan was working. They were giving Eliza as much time as they could. They wanted to help her get away to freedom. Finally, after everything was righted, Mr. Haley mounted his ride. Sam and Andy got on their horses. And then Haley turned to the two slave men and he said, "Now, you're more familiar with this territory. Which way did Eliza run, do you reckon?" "Well," said Sam, "you never can tell. There's two ways to get to Ohio. There's the road down by the river. Of course, that road ain't been used in a long time because it's all twisty and windy along the riverbank, so there ain't nobody go on that road unless they want to take their time or they got a friend live along the river they want to see. Everybody knows if you want to get to Ohio in quick fashion, you take the high road. That's why they cut that new road, because it's a straight shot right to the Ohio River where you can catch the ferry to go across. So I reckon now, if you want to get away fast, you'd take the high road. But then if you didn't want nobody to see you, because you was a runaway slave, not that I'm going to run away, mind you, but if you did want to run away, then you might take the road down by the river, because there ain't nobody go on that road and they ain't going to see you. Of course, now we are talking about Eliza and she a woman, and you never can tell what a woman going to do." "Shut up! We'll take the road by the river." Sam's plan was working better and better. He knew Eliza had probably gone on the high road. This would buy her more time. Finally, after they had frustrated Mr. Haley just about as long as they could, they got on the high road and headed off to the ferry crossing on the river. But Eliza by now was far ahead of them. She had already arrived. But it was late winter, and there was a lot of ice floating in the river. In fact, there was so much ice jammed up there in the bend of the river where the ferry usually made its crossing that the boat was not running this day. Eliza didn't know how she was going to get across that river, but she was desperate. She was hiding in a shed behind the ferryman's house until she could figure out a plan. And that's when she heard the beating of horses' hooves on the dirt road. And when she peeped out from her hiding place, she saw Mr. Haley's big white horse and Sam and Andy following close behind. She ducked back into the shadows and waited until they had passed by. And then, with a burst of speed and all the desperation that would cause her to run as fleet as a deer, she ran right down to the riverbank, grabbed up her little boy tight to her chest, and leaped out onto one of those big blocks of ice floating in the river. And from there she leaped to another block, and from that block to a third. She was making her way across that river, one leap at a time. The ice was sharp and jagged, and soon her slippers fell off her feet, her stockings were cut away, she was leaving bloody footprints. When Mr. Haley saw her, he reined his horse in and leaped off and cracked his whip and started to curse again, but he couldn't follow. He was scared to death to jump on that ice. Why, one slip and you'd fall into that frigid water and be drowned. He watched helplessly as Eliza made it all the way across and up onto the other bank and ran off into the woods. He stood there steaming for several minutes. And then he turned around and glared at Sam and Andy and said, "Fine. I suppose she's on her way to Canada. I may never see my property again, but I still have Tom. He's mine fair and square, and I'll make him pay."